My name is Jonathan Manson. I'm one of the principal cellos of the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, and I also play the Viola da Gamba, known as the Bass Viol in English. The viol family actually grew up alongside the violin family for about 300 years. It was a rich and illustrious history. They weren't ancestors as is commonly thought, but they coexisted actually very nicely together. And the three main sizes of the Viola da Gamba are the bass, which is the solo instrument for much of that time, the tenor viol, which is roughly the size of the viola, the treble viol, which more or less is equivalent to the violin in terms of size and pitch, and the three together formed the bulk of the viol consort music, much of which was written in England, which is a huge repertoire. They all have a fairly lightweight resonant construction. They have flat backs and sloping shoulders, which you might recognise from the modern double bass. That's pretty much the only member of the viol family that's survived into the modern orchestra. And they all have 6 strings, apart from this one, which has 7, because it's a copy of a French instrument from the end of the 17th century, when they were interested in extending the range of the instrument downwards to make it more useful as a solo instrument and for continuo. But in general, they have 6 strings tuned in fourths, with a third in the middle, and then down again in fourths to make 2 octaves, and then this one has the extra A down on the bass register. They always have frets, and these are old gut strings which have passed their use-by date, and we tie them on quite tightly. They are slightly adjustable, but you don't want them flapping around too much. And the advantage of frets is that they give you a clarity in the sound, because it's the hard edge of the gut which is actually stopping the string, which effectively makes all the notes open strings in a way, because it's not your finger which is touching the string at that point. And that combination of frets and the tuning in fourths is also could be quite familiar if you know instruments from the lute and guitar families. It's actually much more closely related to other plucked instruments than it is to members of the violin family in that respect. And the fact that it's got this chordal tuning is also extremely useful for a lot of the solo repertoire. French composers in particular revelled in the sonorities of the instrument. And another feature of the viol family instruments is that we hold the bow in a completely different way from the violin family. We hold it underhand, with the middle finger directly touching the hair. And that means the strong stroke is the opposite direction. That's the equivalent of our down bow, which you would play like this on a cello. And the fact that you're in direct contact with the hair also means you can feel the string quite literally through your fingers, rather than mediated by a piece of wood. So that also gives you a very intimate contact with sound production. And I think all of these features together mean that composers could use the viol in a very different way. The music was often written for quite small spaces, sometimes people's houses, sometimes the smaller rooms in your palace. And in those spaces, the viol really thrives because it has a particular intimacy and warmth and a vocal quality which was very much prized by composers during that time. In the 18th century, as performing spaces got bigger and public concerts demanded bigger spaces and orchestras got bigger and the flashy Italianate concertos became more fashionable, viol simply couldn't compete really with violin family instruments, and ultimately by the end of the 18th century they died out. But Bach was one of the composers who, even though the viol was going out of fashion, clearly appreciated some of the very special qualities of the instrument. He wrote 3 beautiful sonatas for the instrument together with harpsichord, and he also used the instrument in both his great passions, the St. John Passion and the Matthew Passion. he uses the gamba very differently in the St. Matthew Passion. It's a little bit earlier in the story and there's a lot more action involved. He uses very cleverly the idea of the gamba as it was featured in France at the time of Louis XIV, the great Sun King, who particularly loved the Viola da Gamba. And it's a very French style of writing which uses a great deal of nobility in the overdotting and these large leaps which are often found in the writing of the French viol composers of the time. And he uses that to convey the wonderful sense in which the heavenly King Christ, who is about to be crucified, is in some way reflected in the glory of the earthly king, Louis XIV. As you can hear, the viola da gamba is an enormously versatile instrument. It has this huge range from all the way below the cello range through a strong tenor into the alto, right up into the violin register, into the treble register. And it's this quality, I think, together with the fact that you can play chords very easily in this tuning, which also mean that you can basically accompany yourself, and a lot of the solo repertoire was in fact designed to be played without any accompaniment at all, because you can add in all the harmonies that you need along the way. I think you can hear this quite nicely illustrated in a very jolly chaconne by the celebrated French viol player Marin Marais.